Leadership, 6 Studies in World Strategy. Book by Henry Kissinger. Chapter 1. Richard Nixon, The Strategy of Equilibrium. A. The world to which Nixon came. B. An unforeseen invitation. C. National security decision-making in the Nixon White House. D. Nixon's worldview, diplomacy and linkage. E. A trip to Europe. F. The Vietnam War and its conclusion. G. Great power diplomacy and arms control. H. Emigration from the Soviet Union. I. The opening to China. J. The Middle East in turmoil. K. The 1973 Middle East War. L. The diplomacy of ceasefire. M. The Middle East peace process. N. Bangladesh and the interlocking Cold War. O. Nixon and the American crisis. 3. Richard Nixon, The Strategy of Equilibrium. The world to which Nixon came. Richard Nixon was one of the most controversial presidents in American history, and the only president obliged to resign from office. He also had a seminal impact on the foreign policy of his period and its aftermath, as a president who reshaped a failing world order at the height of the Cold War. After 5.5 years in office, Nixon had ended American involvement in Vietnam, established the United States as the dominant external power in the Middle East, and imposed a triangular dynamic on the previously bipolar Cold War through the opening to China, ultimately putting the Soviet Union at a decisive strategic disadvantage. From December 1968, when he asked me to serve as his national security advisor, to the end of his presidency in August 1974, I was a close collaborator to his leadership and decision-making. We stayed in regular contact for the remaining 20 years of his life. At the age of 99, I returned to Nixon not to rehearse the controversies of a half-century ago, which I have addressed in 3 volumes of memoirs, but to analyze the thinking and character of a leader who assumed office amid unprecedented cultural and political turmoil, and who transformed the foreign policy of his country by embracing a geopolitical concept of the national interest. By January 20, 1969, when Nixon took the presidential oath of office, the Cold War had reached full maturity. Commitments that the United States had assumed abroad during its post-war period of seemingly limitless power were beginning to prove beyond its material and emotional capacity to sustain. Domestic conflict over Vietnam was nearing an apex of intensity, spurring calls in some quarters for American military withdrawal and political retreat. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were deploying missiles distinguished by enhanced payloads, improved accuracy, and intercontinental range. The Soviet Union was nearing parity with the U.S. in the number of long-range strategic nuclear weapons and, according to some analysts, might even be attaining strategic superiority, raising concerns about sudden doomsday attacks and an extended period of political blackmail. In the months before Nixon's election in November 1968, the challenges his presidency would face began to take shape in 3 major strategic theaters: Europe, the Middle East and East Asia. In August 1968, the Soviet Union, together with its Eastern European satellites, occupied Czechoslovakia, whose sin had been to liberalize its system within the Soviet orbit. In Germany, the Soviet threat to West Berlin, initiated by Premier Nikita Khrushchev's 1958 ultimatum to the Western occupying powers to remove their forces within 6 months, persisted, periodically recurring in the form of a threat by Moscow to blockade the beleaguered city. Europe and Japan, both of which had recovered from the devastation of war under the security umbrella of the U.S., began to compete economically with the U.S. and to nurse their own sometimes differing perceptions of the evolving world order. At the same time, the People's Republic of China, PRC, had become the fifth country to possess the world's most devastating weapons, after the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom and France, following a successful nuclear test in October 1964. Beijing swung between engaging with and withdrawing from the international system, training and financing Maoist guerrillas around the world, yet also, by spring 1967, withdrawing its ambassadors from nearly every country in the world amidst the upheaval of the Cultural Revolution. In the Middle East, Nixon faced a region in the throes of conflict. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, whereby Britain and France had agreed to subsume the territories of the faltering Ottoman Empire under their respective spheres of influence, had led to the formation of largely Arab and Muslim polities that seemed, on the surface, members of a state system comparable to the one created by the Peace of Westphalia. But only on the surface, unlike the European territories still under the essentially Westphalian system. Mid-20th century Middle Eastern states did not reflect common national identities or histories. Despite France and Britain's historical preeminence in the Middle East, each grew progressively less capable of projecting its power there after the bloodletting of the two world wars. Local upheavals, initially sparked by anti-colonial movements, were being swept into larger conflicts within the Arab world, and between Arab countries and the State of Israel. The latter, having been recognized by most Western countries within 2 years of its independence in 1948, was now seeking recognition from neighbors that regarded it as inherently illegitimate and as occupying territory, rightfully theirs. During the decade preceding Nixon's inauguration, the Soviet Union began to exploit this gathering Middle East maelstrom and to exacerbate it by establishing ties with the authoritarian military regimes that had replaced the largely feudal governing structure left by the Ottoman Empire. Newly equipped with Soviet weapons, Arab armies extended the Cold War into a Middle East previously dominated by the West, sharpening the region's disputes and intensifying the risk that they might unleash a global cataclysm. Overshadowing all of these concerns as Nixon assumed office was the bloody stalemate in Vietnam. The preceding Johnson administration had dispatched more than 500,000 American troops to a region as remote from America culturally and psychologically as it was geographically. Over 50,000 more were still on the way there at the time of Nixon's inauguration. The task of extricating the United States from an inconclusive war, and of doing so under the most turbulent domestic circumstances since the American Civil War, fell to Nixon. The 5 years before his election had also witnessed domestic political controversy of an intensity without antecedent in postbellum American history, the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, his brother, and then Democratic presidential frontrunner, Robert and the path-breaking civil rights leader Martin Luther King, Jr. Violent protests over Vietnam, and demonstrations against the assassination of King, racked the streets of U.S. cities and shut down Washington for days on end. American history is replete with raucous domestic controversies, but the situation confronting Nixon was unprecedented in that, for the first time, an emerging national elite had convinced itself that defeat in war was at once strategically inevitable and ethically desirable. Such a conviction implied the breakdown of the centuries-long consensus that the national interest represented a legitimate, even moral, end. In some respects, this set of beliefs marked the re-emergence of an earlier isolationist impulse, according to which America's entanglement in foreign troubles was not only unnecessary for the nation's well-being but corrosive to its character. But now, rather than arguing that the nation's values were too elevated to countenance involvement in faraway conflicts. This new strand of isolationism held that America itself had become too corrupted to serve as a moral guidepost overseas. Proponents of this position, having secured a foothold, and eventually a near-dominant influence, in institutions of higher learning, viewed the Vietnam tragedy neither within a framework of geopolitics nor as an ideological struggle, but as the herald of a national catharsis that would spur a long-overdue turn inward. An unforeseen invitation. While teaching at Harvard University, I had also acted as a part-time foreign policy advisor to New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, Nixon's principal rival for the Republican nomination in both 1960 and 1968. In consequence, I did not expect any invitation to serve on the staff of the newly elected president. Yet such a call came, and I was offered the post of National Security Advisor, the second highest-ranking presidential appointment not subject to Senate confirmation, behind the White House Chief of Staff. Nixon's decision to bestow such a responsibility on a Harvard professor with a record of opposing him illustrated both the president-elect's generosity of spirit and his willingness to break with conventional political thinking. Shortly after his electoral victory in November 1968, Nixon invited me to our first substantive meeting at his New York transition headquarters in the Pierre Hotel. I had encountered him only once before, fleetingly, at a Christmas party hosted by the formidable Clare Boothe Luce. The meeting provided an occasion to review the current international situation via a thoughtful, relaxed promenade through major foreign policy challenges, in the course of which Nixon shared his views and invited my comments. He offered no hint that the meeting was related to staffing his administration, let alone intended to assess my suitability for a particular position. As I was leaving, Nixon introduced me to a lanky Californian whom he identified as his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. Without explanation, Nixon then ordered Haldeman to establish a direct telephone link to my office at Harvard. Haldeman wrote down the president-elect's order on a yellow pad but proceeded to do nothing about it, thus providing, along with my introduction to the multifaceted personality of the incoming president, an advanced lesson in the nature of bureaucratic conduct in a Nixon White House. Some presidential statements were symbolic, suggesting a direction but not a call for an immediate action. Intrigued but somewhat uncertain, I returned to Harvard to await developments. A few days later, John Mitchell, a law partner in the same firm as Nixon and on the verge of being nominated as Attorney General, telephoned me with a query: "Are you going to take the job or not?" When I replied, "What job?" he muttered something that sounded like another screw-up, before inviting me to meet with the president-elect again the following day. This time, the position of National Security Advisor was offered explicitly. Awkwardly, I requested some time for reflection and consultation with associates familiar with my previous political positions. Other presidents or chief executives I have known, hearing such a vacillating reply, would have relieved me of the need for reflection by ending the discussion then and there. Instead, Nixon told me to take a week and, touchingly, suggested that I consult Lon Fuller, his former contract law professor at Duke, who was then teaching at Harvard Law School and was familiar with Nixon's way of thinking and conduct. The next day, I consulted with Nelson Rockefeller, who had just returned from a trip to his ranch in Venezuela. Rockefeller's reaction not only put an end to any ambivalence but also demonstrated that there was still underlying unity in the country. He chided me for postponing my decision and urged me to accept Nixon's offer immediately. "When the president invites you to important service," he observed, "delay is not an appropriate response." Keep in mind, Rockefeller added, that Nixon is taking a much bigger chance on you than you are on him. I telephoned Nixon that afternoon to say that I would be honored to serve in his administration. Nixon and I would eventually develop a relationship which, in its operational character, might have been described as a partnership, although true partnership rarely exists when the power is so unequally distributed between the two sides. The president can dismiss his security advisor without procedure or warning and has the authority to impose his preferences, without formal notice or discussion. And, whatever contribution the security advisor might make, the president bears the ultimate responsibility for the decisions. These realities notwithstanding, Nixon never treated me as a subordinate when it came to issues of national security and foreign policy. Rather, he dealt with me as a kind of academic colleague. The same regard did not extend to domestic policy or electoral politics. I was never invited to meetings on these subjects, except during the Pentagon Papers episode, when classified Defense Department documents had been leaked. Our relationship assumed this collegial form from the beginning. Throughout, Nixon avoided derogatory references about my previous association with Nelson Rockefeller. Even when he was under great pressure, his conduct toward me was invariably courteous. This consistent graciousness was all the more remarkable because, side by side with the decisive and thoughtful Nixon described in these pages, there was another Nixon, insecure about his image, uncertain of his authority and plagued by a nagging self-doubt. This other Nixon was accompanied by a version of Adam Smith's impartial spectator, that is, a second you, standing outside yourself, observing and judging your actions. Nixon seemed to me to have been haunted by such critical self-awareness all his life. This part of Nixon involved a restless pursuit of approbation, a prize frequently withheld by the very groups that mattered most to him. Even within his established relationships, an element of reserve was palpable, while encounters outside his inner circle, particularly those involving persons of stature, were likely to be treated as demanding a kind of performance. Nixon's purpose was not always to communicate information, rather, his language was often meant to convey an impression of some end that had not necessarily been revealed to the other party. Given these complexities, Nixon would, on occasion, make statements that did not reflect the full scope of his designs. This conduct should not be confused with indecision. He was clear about his goals and pursued them with determination and subtlety. At the same time, however, he often sought to preserve his options by selecting the most advantageous time and forum in which to debate them. The combination of these qualities produced the special characteristics of the Nixon administration. Extremely knowledgeable, especially about foreign policy issues, and highly effective in presenting his analyses, Nixon nevertheless recoiled from face-to-face confrontations. Loath to transmit direct orders to disagreeing cabinet members, he would choose Haldeman or Mitchell for that task, or me, on issues of foreign policy. Serving as an assistant to Nixon required an awareness of this modus operandi. Not every comment made or order issued by the president was intended to be interpreted or carried out literally. The instruction to Haldeman to install a direct phone line to my office at the end of our first meeting is one example. He wanted to convey to his staff that he was going to seek to add me to his team, but he was not yet ready to offer me the position in circumstances in which I might refuse it in the hearing of others. Another more consequential example, in August 1969, an American airliner en route from Rome to Israel was hijacked by Palestinian terrorists and flown to Damascus. When I communicated the news to Nixon, who was enjoying a Saturday evening dinner with old friends in Florida, he replied, Bomb the airport of Damascus. Rather than serving as an official directive, this statement was intended to impress both his advisors and his dining companions with his determination to put an end to hijackings. As Nixon well knew, however, initiating any such military action requires more than a simple order from the president. There needs to be a follow-up directive containing operational instructions to the implementing departments. In anticipation of such a follow-up decision, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Earl Wheeler, and I spent much of the evening ensuring that preliminary steps for such a strike were taken, specifically, moving a 6th Fleet aircraft carrier towards Cyprus to position it to carry out the order. Although a president's staff is pledged to execute his orders, it is also obliged to give him the full opportunity to reflect on the implications of his actions. In this case, Nixon settled the issue the following morning. As part of his morning briefing, I updated him on the Damascus airport hostage situation, conveying that the 6th Fleet's ships were now near Cyprus. "Did anything else happen?" he asked. When I replied that nothing had, he responded with a single word, "Good," delivered without moving a facial muscle. Nothing further was said or done about the airstrike, too. Thus Nixon's immediate entourage learned that sweeping statements were not necessarily intended to result in explicit actions. Often, they conveyed a mood or were used to assess an interlocutor's views. To postpone irreversible actions until the president could make a considered decision, Haldeman set up a staff system seeing to it that Nixon's Oval Office meetings took place in the presence of a presidential assistant. The senior advisors, in turn, were obliged to pass on directives through the White House Chief of Staff. Trouble could arise when those with no regular contact with the president found themselves in his company as he debated his options on an issue with himself. Illustrative here is former Eisenhower aide and friend of Nixon, Bryce Harlow's pithy explanation for the Watergate debacle. "Some damn fool got into the Oval Office and did what he was told." Unsurprisingly, Nixon's own assessment of his qualities was less oblique than the foregoing account might suggest. Shortly after my July 1971 secret visit to China, and Nixon's announcement that he himself would make the journey the following year, Nixon sent me recommendations for briefing the press. Referring to himself in the third person, he wrote, "One effective line you could use in your talks with the press is how RN is uniquely prepared for this meeting, and how ironically in many ways he has similar characteristics and background to Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai." I am just listing a few of the items that might be emphasized. 1. Strong convictions. 2. Came up through adversity. 3. At his best in a crisis. Cool. Unflappable. 4. A tough, bold, strong leader. Willing to take chances where necessary. 5. A man who takes the long view, never being concerned about tomorrow's headlines but about how the policy will look years from now. 6. A man with a philosophical turn of mind. 7. A man who works without notes. In meetings with 73 heads of state and heads of government, RN has had hours of conversation without any notes. 8. A man who knows Asia and has made a particular point of traveling in Asia and studying Asia. 9. A man who in terms of his personal style is very strong and very tough where necessary, steely, but who is subtle and appears almost gentle. The tougher his position usually, the lower his voice. That the note is evidence of both significant insecurity and determined self-promotion requires no elaboration. Yet Nixon's self-assessment was essentially accurate. He did have a wealth of foreign policy experience. He was at his most effective in a crisis. He was bold but given to careful, occasionally excruciating deliberation and analysis. He had an enormous appetite for information. He took the long view, engaged in careful reflections about the nation's challenges, and was often at his best in high-pressure, set-piece meetings with other world leaders, at least those involving presentation rather than negotiation. That he was preoccupied with the appearance of being in charge, to the point that he sometimes embellished the record, does not contradict the achievements of his administration. Given the national stakes involved and the time pressure under which decisions often need to be made, no senior White House relationship can be entirely free of friction. In my own case, Nixon's insecurities occasionally led to presidential resentment when the media emphasized my contribution to national policy, to the derogation of his own. The French philosopher Raymond Aron, my lifelong friend and intellectual mentor, once commented that the press's prominent coverage of my role served as an alibi for its hostility to Nixon. The resulting tensions were explicitly addressed only rarely, and, even then, never by Nixon himself, but by associates such as Haldeman or domestic affairs advisor John Ehrlichman. Nonetheless, I never experienced the kind of language which, I later learned, Nixon occasionally inflicted on others. When the transcripts of Nixon's Oval Office conversations became public, I called George Shultz, who had served as budget director and secretary of the Treasury, to ask whether I had become so inured to profanity that I did not remember Nixon's use of it. Shultz's recollections were comparable to mine. In our dealings with him, Nixon's language was courteous and fastidious. Nixon's handicaps, his anxiety, the insecurities that prompted his need to extract maximum respect, his reluctance to confront face-to-face disagreements, ultimately damaged his presidency. But the achievements of Nixon's career require recognition as a stupendous effort to transcend inhibitions that would have defeated a lesser leader. National security decision-making in the Nixon White House. Every White House establishes a framework for decision-making to facilitate the choices only the commander-in-chief is in a position to make. As soon as he was appointed Chief of Staff, Haldeman created a White House organization that enabled Nixon to balance his convictions and his inhibitions, obscuring his weaknesses while achieving a considerable measure of coherence. Access to the president, as a general matter, was in the presence of one of two White House presidential assistants, Ehrlichman for domestic policy, me for national security issues. Our offices were responsible for preparing the president for each upcoming meeting, sketching both issues that might be raised and potential responses to offer. Nixon would study these recommendations carefully before meetings but never had notes in front of him during the actual conversation. When Nixon and I were both in Washington, I was generally his first appointment of the day. I accompanied him on his foreign trips and attended every official meeting. When either of us was traveling domestically, we typically communicated by phone at least once a day. The first subject on our agenda was generally the presidential daily brief, prepared by the Central Intelligence Agency. Absent a crisis, Nixon spent relatively little time on day-to-day issues and much more on the historical background or dynamics of a particular region or situation. He was always focused on what constituted potential turning points or key impending decisions. During these discussions, which frequently extended over many hours, the strategic thinking of the Nixon administration was shaped. Having served as Eisenhower's vice president, Nixon sought to replicate his predecessor's national security procedures while adapting them to his requirements. To that end, he asked General Andrew Goodpaster, who for a period had coordinated Eisenhower's National Security Council, to work with me in setting up a comparable structure. Under Eisenhower, NSC staff had essentially prepared for meetings by collecting departmental views. During the subsequent Kennedy and Johnson periods, the Goodpaster staff was transformed by McGeorge Bundy and Walt Rostow to about 50 professionals, including academics, who participated in substantive preparations for the NSC meetings. In the Nixon administration, it retained a similar size. In the contemporary period, it has grown to as many as 400. When, early during the presidential transition, Goodpaster and I called on Eisenhower, then a patient with terminal heart illness at Walter Reed Hospital, I still harbored the notion, inherited from my Harvard days, that the former president's mind was as vague as the grammar he occasionally deployed in his press conferences. I quickly learned otherwise. He was familiar with national security issues in substance as well as their administrative ramifications. Eisenhower's facial features were vivid and expressive, exuding self-assurance produced by decades of command. His manner of speaking was forceful, direct and eloquent. After welcoming Goodpaster, Eisenhower wasted no time in making his initial point. I might learn that he had not favored my appointment as security advisor, he said, because he did not consider academics adequately prepared for high-level decision-making. Nevertheless, he would give me whatever help he could. His assessment was that President Johnson's approach, in which the State Department had chaired the interdepartmental aspect of the national security process, had not worked because the Defense Department had resisted state leadership, and in any case state personnel were better suited to dialogue than strategic decision-making. Eisenhower then outlined his recommendations, the essence of which was to place the national security operation under the White House Security Advisor. The Security Advisor or his designee would chair various regional and technical subcommittees. A committee at the Deputy Secretary level should then vet the group's deliberations for the National Security Council. Goodpaster drafted these recommendations, and Nixon adopted them. The structure has remained essentially intact ever since. Within any given administration, however, intangibles of personality will inevitably affect the actual distribution of power. During NSC meetings in which the designated cabinet officials, secretaries of state, defense, and treasury as well as CIA director, were present, Nixon was skillful at formulations that implied a desired goal without committing to a particular implementation. Exploration of options became his way of eliciting information about potential courses of action. Without involving a confrontation over a decision, this approach enabled the president to separate long-range policy from day-to-day processes. It also permitted him to grasp the range of options as if he were dealing with an abstract intellectual problem, independent of personal preferences or departmental prerogatives. Wherever feasible, Nixon's actual decision would be conveyed subsequently, when, I can think of no exception, he would not have to confront any disagreement face to face. Adopting Eisenhower's NSC plan facilitated Nixon's longtime determination to control foreign policy from the White House. A decision memorandum issued in his name would announce his plan of action. In particularly controversial situations, as, for example, in the 1970 incursion into Cambodia in pursuit of North Vietnamese divisions stationed there, Haldeman or Attorney General John Mitchell personally reinforced the final decision to the relevant cabinet secretary, indicating that it was beyond further discussion. Nixon's inhibitions did not constrain his decisiveness. In moments of crisis, he drove the process, if indirectly, via my staff. And at several key points, such as during the 1972 response to North Vietnam's Easter Offensive against the South, or the October 1973 strategic airlift of weapons and supplies to Israel during the Yom Kippur War, he intervened by issuing a direct order. By January 1969, when Nixon took office, the nature of the American debate over Vietnam had undergone an upheaval. The early domestic disputes about Southeast Asia had remained traditional. They concerned disagreements over the means for achieving agreed-upon ends. Universities debated Vietnam at teach-ins, which took the good faith of the opposing sides for granted. By the Johnson presidency, judgments of the American conduct in Vietnam turned on precisely that issue of good faith. Opponents declared the war immoral and contrary to traditional American values. Their response was a challenge to both established policies and the moral legitimacy of successive administrations, to the point where some anti-war activists sought to undermine the very operation of government through huge public demonstrations, sometimes for days on end. Another tactic was the massive leaking of classified governmental information, justified by a definition of open government incompatible with any element of secrecy. Secrecy, Nixon acknowledged in his memoirs, unquestionably exacts a high price in the form of a less free and creative interchange of ideas within the government. But, he added, in some quantity it is always necessary in affairs of state. I can say unequivocally that without secrecy there would have been no opening to China, no SALT agreement with the Soviet Union, and no peace agreement ending the Vietnam War. In this connection, Eisenhower taught me an essential lesson about serving in Washington. In mid-March 1969, when the former president was clearly weakening, Nixon invited me to join in briefing his predecessor on a recent NSC meeting regarding the Middle East, which had discussed the growing Soviet military presence in the region and the balance in our response between diplomatic and other measures. As he was in the process of coming to a decision, Nixon asked me to outline for Eisenhower the options discussed by the NSC. The next morning, the content of the NSC meeting appeared in the media. General Robert Schultz, Eisenhower's military aide, called very early that morning to connect me with the former president. Unleashing a torrent of expletives not commonly associated with his benign public persona, Eisenhower castigated me for the constraint on Nixon's options brought about by the leakage of NSC deliberations. When I asked whether he thought my office had done the leaking, he went through another catalogue of invectives to underline that my assignment was to protect the secrecy of classified information throughout the entire national security system. I had not carried out that assignment if I construed it as only applying to the security of my own office. My reply, that we had been in office for only 2 months and had done our utmost to control the leaking during that time, found no greater favor. Young man, I was then 46, let me give you one fundamental piece of advice, Eisenhower said in an almost fatherly tone. Never tell anyone that you are unable to carry out a task entrusted to you. Those were the last words I heard from Eisenhower. He died 2 weeks later. Nixon's worldview. Nixon's assessments of the past and intuitions about the future were derived both from his substantial international experience as a political figure and his years of reflection while out of office. International travel in his position as vice president, and presumed future presidential candidate, had brought him into contact with world leaders who sought to understand American thinking and to gauge his own future prospects. In these circles he was treated as a serious figure, an attitude not always in evidence among domestic adversaries or journalists. Nixon's convictions about foreign policy did not fit neatly into existing political categories. In his congressional career, he had been conspicuously engaged in the debate over the trial of the former State Department official and alleged Soviet agent Alger Hiss, whom much of the political establishment regarded as the victim of a witch hunt, until, and even after, he was convicted of perjury and imprisoned. Thus, by the time Nixon was inaugurated, both conservatives and liberals had a well-formed conception of him. Conservatives saw him as a staunch anti-communist and hardline Cold Warrior, expecting him to display a confrontational style of diplomacy. Liberals worried he might initiate a period of American muscle flexing abroad and domestic controversy at home. Nixon's foreign policy views were far more nuanced than his critics' perception of them. Molded by his experiences of public service in the Navy during the Second World War, in Congress, and as vice president, he was unshakably convinced of the basic legitimacy of the American way of life, particularly the opportunities for social mobility, as his own life personified. In keeping with the foreign policy verities of the day, he believed in America's special responsibility to defend the cause of freedom internationally, and especially the freedom of America's democratic allies. In seeking to end the conflict in Vietnam, which he had inherited, he was driven by the specter of the impact of an American retreat on the nation's credibility as an ally, but also as a power and presence in the world at large. Nixon's view of America's international duties was put forward during an address on July 6, 1971, as he explained the U.S. obligation in Vietnam in essentially nonpartisan terms, blaming neither his Democratic predecessors nor the anti-war left. He acknowledged and specified the then prevalent criticisms of U.S. policy. The United States can't be trusted with power. The United States should recede from the world scene and take care of its own problems and leave world leadership to somebody else, because we engage in immorality in the conduct of our foreign policy. Accepting that the U.S. had made initial missteps in Vietnam, as it had in other wars, he then asked the central question: what other nation in the world would you like to have in the position of preeminent power? America was a nation that did not seek the preeminent world position. It came to us because of what had happened in World War II. But here is a nation that has helped its former enemies, that is generous now to those that might be its opponents. That the world is very fortunate to have in a position of world leadership. While Nixon reiterated his post-war vision of U.S. global leadership, he challenged prevailing American foreign policy assumptions. Then, as now, an important school of thought maintained that stability and peace were the normal state of international affairs, while conflict was the consequence of either misunderstanding or malevolence. Once hostile powers were decisively overcome or defeated, the underlying harmony or trust would re-emerge. In this quintessentially American conception, conflict was not inherent but artificial. Nixon's perception was more dynamic. He viewed peace as a state of fragile and fluid equilibrium among the great powers, a precarious balance that in turn constituted a vital component of international stability. In an interview for Time in January 1972, he stressed a balance of power as a prerequisite for peace. It is when one nation becomes infinitely more powerful in relation to its potential competitor that the danger of war arises. So I believe in a world in which the United States is powerful. I think it will be a safer world and a better world if we have a strong, healthy United States, Europe, Soviet Union, China, Japan, each balancing the other, not playing one against the other, an even balance. Any of the great British statesmen of the 19th century would have made a comparable statement about the balancing of power in Europe. Although Europe and Japan never did materialize as powers of comparable capacity during Nixon's period in office, triangulation between China and the Soviet Union became a principle of U.S. policy from Nixon's tenure until the end of the Cold War and beyond. Indeed, it contributed importantly to the conflict's successful outcome. Nixon placed his strategy into a specific American context. At the dawn of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt, 1901–9, had expressed the view that one day America would inherit Britain's role of upholding the global equilibrium, which was itself based on the experience of maintaining a balance of power on the European continent. But subsequent presidents eschewed this kind of analysis. Instead, the vision championed by Woodrow Wilson, 1913–21, became dominant, namely, that international stability must be sought by means of collective security, defined by the joint enforcement of international law, in Wilson's words, not a balance of power, but a community of power, not organized rivalries, but an organized common peace. Nixon sought to restore the balance of power thinking of Theodore Roosevelt to American foreign policy. Like Roosevelt, he considered the national interest to be the defining objective in the pursuit of national strategy and foreign policy. Recognizing that national interests are often in tension with each other and not always reconcilable in so-called win-win outcomes, he saw the statesman's task as identifying and managing those differences. This could be accomplished either by mitigating them or, when necessary and as a last resort, by overcoming them with force. In such extreme cases, he was prone to apply a maxim he frequently put to his associates: you pay the same price for conducting policy half-heartedly or hesitantly as for doing it the correct way and with conviction. In Nixon's foreign policy vision, the United States should be the principal shaper of a fluid system of shifting balances. This role had no definable terminal point, but if America resigned from it, he believed, there would be global chaos. America's permanent responsibility was to participate in an international dialogue and to take leadership of that dialogue where appropriate. In his first inaugural address, Nixon therefore proclaimed a new era of negotiations, diplomacy, and linkage. Nixon's foreign policy emphasized a twofold approach toward adversaries. One was to build American strength and alliances, especially the Atlantic Alliance. The other was to maintain a constant dialogue with adversaries, like the Soviet Union and China, via the era of negotiations. By linking geopolitical and ideological designs, Nixon sought to overcome two obstacles that had made it difficult for Americans to meet their international challenges. In Diplomacy, 1994, I would label these concepts the psychiatric versus the theological approach. The former holds that negotiations are ends in themselves, so that, once state adversaries meet face to face, their dispute may be dealt with as a manageable and potentially resolvable misunderstanding, almost similar to personal quarrels. The theological approach conceives of adversaries as infidels or apostates and treats the very fact of negotiations with them as a kind of sin. By contrast, Nixon conceived negotiations as an aspect of overall strategy, part of a seamless web of relevant factors, among them the diplomatic, economic, military, psychological, and ideological. Despite being a veteran anti-communist, Nixon did not regard ideological differences with communist states as barriers to diplomatic engagement. Rather, he viewed diplomacy as a preferred method for thwarting hostile designs and transforming adversarial relations into either engagement or the isolation of the adversary. Thus, the opening to China was based on the conviction that Mao Zedong's communist rigidities could be offset by exploiting the Soviet threat to China's security. Likewise, during the October 1973 Arab-Israeli War, his conviction that Moscow's Middle East clients would be unable to achieve their regional objectives by force created a strategic and psychological opening to weaken Soviet influence and put America in the position to broker peace. Nixon was never tempted by the conceit that establishing personal rapport with foreign leaders could transcend conflicting national interests. We all must recognize that the United States and the Soviet Union have very profound and fundamental differences, Nixon said during a 1970 speech to the Union General Assembly, explaining that to think otherwise would slight the seriousness of our disagreements. Genuine progress in our relations calls for specifics, not merely atmospherics. A true détente is built by a series of actions, not by a superficial shift in the apparent mood. Negotiating with ideological adversaries from a position of strength would lead to an order favorable to American interests and security aspirations. Following these principles, Nixon early in his first term obtained congressional approval for national missile defense, an initiative that many regarded as a hawkish provocation of Moscow. Yet in the following decades, missile defense has proven an indispensable component of strategy. Similarly, when Soviet-backed and equipped Syrian forces invaded Jordan in 1970, Nixon invoked a regional alert, and when Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev threatened intervention at the end of the Yom Kippur War in October 1973, he raised a global alert. Although he was adamant about containing the Soviet Union, his ultimate goal was to build a structure of peace. Explaining his perspective during the 1970 UN General Assembly, Nixon said, "Power is a fact of international life. Our mutual obligation is to discipline that power, to seek together with other nations to ensure that it is used to maintain peace, not to threaten the peace." Still, how was peace to be defined and achieved? George Kennan, the visionary architect of the post-Second World War containment policy, along with Secretaries of State Dean Acheson and John Foster Dulles, had seemed content to wait out the Soviet Union by building up American strength, confident that history would eventually bring about a Soviet transformation or collapse. But 2 decades marked by tense thermonuclear stalemate, compounded by the trauma of Vietnam, had left the U.S. in need of a more active strategy. Nixon's policy was designed to move Moscow and Beijing to accept the legitimacy of the international system, and behave according to principles compatible with America's security interests and values by exploiting their differences via diplomacy. Nixon described himself as a skilled negotiator. This was accurate with respect to big-picture discussions designed to draw an interlocutor into a strategic dialogue. But his reluctance to deal with direct confrontation disinclined him to engage in the reciprocal balancing and adjustment of nuances by which diplomacy operates. In any event, negotiating detailed diplomatic settlements is a craft from which presidents would be well advised to refrain. Given the vast self-confidence needed to achieve their eminence, presidents as negotiators are likely to prove either too accommodating or too confrontational, or both, the former when they rely on their ability to manipulate by personal charm, the latter when, drawing on the pressures that enabled their domestic rise, they equate diplomacy with confrontation. A diplomatic deadlock between top leaders complicates any adjustment within the internal governance of both sides. Another reason why detailed issues should be dealt with at lower levels, where technical expertise is more concentrated and accommodation less personally threatening. If only a few issues remain for the final phase, leaders will be liberated to crown a substantive outcome with symbolic adjustment and a celebratory flourish. Nixon's strengths as a statesman resided at the two ends of geopolitical strategy: analytical rigor in design and great boldness in execution. He was at his best in dialogues over long-range objectives and in efforts to draw his counterpart onto the edges of a strategic undertaking. While restless during face-to-face negotiations over the minutiae of strategic arms limitations with Brezhnev, At the Moscow Summit of 1972, Nixon was eager to discuss principles of U.S.-Chinese geopolitics with Zhou Enlai, and effective in doing so, during the Beijing Summit that same year, laying the groundwork for a parallel U.S.-China strategy to thwart the Soviet drive for global hegemony. Nixon combined his attitude to negotiations with a strategy that was uncongenial